Hi, I'm Mr. Wahlberg, and I'm glad you're here. Welcome to my basement. In our last class, we started the Spanish American War. Today, we're going to fight it through to its end. It's also going to come up with some real estate opportunities. I'm not sure that's the best way to say it, but you'll figure it out as we go. So, dear student, incline your ear and hear our stories that you might find your place among his delights. We have four objectives today. By the end of this class, you should be able to trace the course of the Spanish American War and its results. You should be able to describe U.S. involvement in Puerto Rico and in Cuba. You should be able to identify the causes and effects of the Philippine American War. And you should be able to explain the purpose of the open door policy in China. But let's begin in Roman numeral number 16. Nevertheless, on April 11th of 1898, William McKinley asked Congress for a greater use of force against Spain, and on April 12th, the United States declared war. The first battle with Spain occurred not in Cuba, which is, I think, where most people would expect it to have happened, but in the Spanish colony of the Philippines. There, American ships could go attack the Spanish Navy without, unexpectedly, without any kind of a notice onto it. In the first, so on April 30th, Commodore George Dewey trapped the Spanish fleet in the harbor of Manila. The next morning, he opened fire, and the attack was so intense that a huge cloud of explosion smoke totally blocked the view of the Spanish. So, like, the Spanish couldn't see the American fleet, and actually the American fleet couldn't see the Spanish. They couldn't see what they were shooting into. Yet Commodore Dewey continued to order the attack. When the smoke cleared, they realized that why the Spanish never fought back. The entire Spanish fleet in the Philippines had been sunk. Dewey's victory allowed United States troops to go and land in the Philippines. Though, the treatment in the Philippines wasn't nearly as extreme as it was in Cuba, but there was a pretty similar pattern in both places. The Spanish oppression was similar in the Philippines as it was in Cuba, and they had also had a similar revolta movement. Filipinos were led by their rebel leader, Emilio Aguinaldo, and Aguinaldo supported Dewey's efforts to go take the islands. And in August of 1898, Spanish troops in Manila surrendered to American troops. So you had the Philippine insurrection movement join the Americans to go oust the Spanish from the Philippine Islands. Subpoint C, the U.S. presence in Cuba. So let's turn back to this hemisphere. The United States presence in Cuba began with a naval blockade, originally shutting off any, Spanish ships from coming in to the island, and it sealed the Spanish fleet also in the harbor. So not only were there no Spanish ships coming in, there was none going out, and they were sealed there in the harbor of Santiago. Now, unlike the United States Navy, the United States Army was actually a pretty small force. So we talked in a previous class how the U.S. Navy had been built up under the influence of Alfred T. Mahan, but there was no similar movement to go build up the Army there as well. So the United States Army was a pretty small professional force. It's made up of, honestly, mostly pretty poorly prepared and poorly supplied volunteered troops. Around 125,000 Americans volunteered to go fight in Cuba. So suddenly the Army, swelled in size. But there actually weren't enough modern guns to go around, and the uniforms were, frankly, the Army uniforms were the heavy wool ones that they were used in the Civil War, and they were hardly appropriate for going and fighting in a tropical country. The officers were more interested in telling old Civil War battle stories than they were in actually training these brand new troops, and so they sent them into battle ill-prepared and under-equipped. This is where we meet in subpoint D, the group known as the Rough Riders, where in June of 1898, around 17,000 U.S. troops landed in Santiago de Cuba, and including a group known as the Rough Riders. The Rough Riders was a volunteer cavalry under the direction of Leonard Wood and Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt had been the Undersecretary of the Navy. He'd had a military job, but a paper-pushing job, and gave it up because he thought there would be more action in joining the war, so he actually switched branches and then led a command of the Rough Riders. On July 1st of 1898, the most famous battle of Cuba took place near Santiago. The first battle was on a place known as Kettle Hill. Kettle Hill was a risky uphill charge. It was led by 2 African-American regiments and the Rough Riders. The African-American regiments actually fought more heroically than the Rough Riders, but we know that group today better. That cleared the way for the United States to take what was actually a more strategically important position known as San Juan Hill. Roosevelt and the Rough Riders, like I said, they honestly played a fairly small position, a minor role. Nevertheless, Teddy Roosevelt, and we're going to learn more about this, is a master of self-propaganda, and he came out as the hero of San Juan Hill, and the Rough Riders get all the credit for it. 2 days later, the Spanish fleet tried to make a daring escape of breaking through the American blockade, and that led to a naval battle that destroyed the entire Spanish fleet in Cuba. So the U.S. Navy has gone and destroyed the Spanish fleet in the Philippines and destroyed the Spanish fleet in Cuba as well. With no oppositional support, the U.S. troops went and invaded into Puerto Rico soon after there. Subpoint E, and here we meet the Treaty of Paris. So, okay, there's been like 30 treaties of Paris over the years, and some of them are pretty important and some of them seem fairly minor. But nevertheless, this Treaty of Paris was won in August of 1898. By the way, if you're ever playing a trivia game and you ever have to guess on a treaty and you're not sure what to guess the Treaty of Paris. You got a pretty good shot at it. But so they go ahead and settle the Treaty of Paris to go settle the Spanish-American War. Spain and the United States signed an armistice at first in August of 1898, and then they met in Paris to go make their treaty. Secretary of State John Hay called the conflict, the Spanish-American War, he called it a splendid little war with actual fighting lasting less than 15 weeks. So from tip to tail, it was under 4 months. The Treaty of Paris, though, started a debate at home about the nature of imperialism, whether it was right to go annex the Philippines. President McKinley tried, and I think honestly weakly tried, to go justify this annexation of the Philippines. He tried to make the case on moral grounds. He said that, the people of the Philippines, the Filipinos, should be educated and they should be Christianized, seeming to forget that the Filipinos, the islands, the whole country itself was one of the most Catholic countries in the Eastern Hemisphere, and that Christianity had been practiced in the Philippines since the 16th century. So McKinley's like, oh yes, we should go civilize and Christianize them. And frankly, they've been practicing Christianity longer in the Philippines than we had in the United States. But opponents to imperialism, and here we're going to meet a group that becomes important for a while. Opponents to imperialism gave the political, moral, and economic arguments against the annexation. Some felt that it was a violation of the spirit of the Declaration of Independence, what like Americans had so nobly fought for. It seemed like we were so readily giving up to go take on a new imperial place. Some African-American advocate Booker T. Washington, he wrote that the United States should really worry about race relations at home before we go trying to take on and solving problems in the rest of the world. Labor leaders, people like Samuel Gompers, said, okay, so we take over the Philippines and we make it American soil, and now we've just got a whole bunch of new people who are going to compete against Americans for jobs, and Gompers says that's bad for working people, and as a labor union president, he's really concerned about that part. Nevertheless, the Treaty of Paris was ratified by Congress in 1899, and it gave the United States an empire, including places like Guam and Puerto Rico and the Philippines. Roman numeral number 17. During the Spanish-American War, General Nelson Miles occupied Puerto Rico, and he promised the Puerto Ricans that the United States was there to protect their lives and their property. That protection was carried out by military rule. Puerto Rico's real value was as a strategic post in the Caribbean. Really, that as an island that was small and defensible, it was a good launching site for the future protection of a future canal in Panama, which we don't have yet. We'll have one soon, but Americans see it on the horizon and ready to go defend American interests in Panama, and that's more or less why we end up in Puerto Rico. Many Cubans, particularly Jose Marti, whom we previously met, he was the Cuban patriot who led the rebellion against Spain. A lot of Cubans, including Marti, feared that the United States would end up ruling over Cuba no differently than the Spanish had ruled over Cuba. Some of those fears seemed justified because any Cubans who protested this new transition to American rule found themselves imprisoned or exiled from the island. Now, on the other hand, the American military government did help rebuild the country after a destructive guerrilla war. A lot of the country of Cuba had been destroyed more or less by their own people in a destructive rebellion against the Spanish. And the army goes and rebuilds a lot of those places. They rebuilt the farms and organized elementary schools. They provided humanitarian relief like food and clothes for thousands of displaced Cubans. Things like sanitation improvements and medical care. They led to more or less the entire elimination of yellow fever in Cuba, and that had been a scourge on the island, killing hundreds of people every year. Subpoint C. Cuba wrote its own constitution in the year 1900 to go be established as its independent country, and it didn't mention anything about its relationship with the United States. So the United States insisted that Cuba add a part to its constitution, which we know today as the Platt Amendment, which specified several things about its relationship between, the two countries. Under the amendment, Cuba could not go into debt that its government couldn't repay. It also couldn't make treaties that limited its independence or allow a foreign power to control any Cuban land. So these are positions that are, about Cuban independence, but America also sees them as a way of avoiding getting us tangled up in Cuban problems. They also said that the United States had the right to interfere in Cuba, intervene in Cuba. I suppose it's not a Freudian slip, a malapropism? I'm not sure. Anyway, had the right to interfere in Cuba, and that the United States could buy or lease land on the island for naval positions, in particular for naval refueling stations. So the United States refused to withdraw its troops until Cuba passed the Platt Amendment, which set off these torchlight protests to the Governor General Leonard Wood, like marching all the way up to his house. Others said that Cuba should just go resume its war, but instead of with the Spanish, this time with the United States. The America stood firm, though, and Cuba eventually adopted the Platt Amendment in 1903. And then Cuba became a protectorate. This is an important word, and I want you to remember it. A protectorate is a type of country whose affairs are partly controlled by another one. They're an independent country, but they're only so independent. Subpoint D. The United States wanted a strong political presence to go protect American businesses, particularly in a couple of key industries, that of sugar and tobacco, but also mining and railroads and utilities. A lot of Americans objected to these entanglements, considering them more or less colonial entanglements, thinking they weren't necessary for business and that colonies themselves are un-American. And why would we be going and setting up a new, essentially, colony as a protectorate in Cuba? Still, the United States State Department continued to push for control of Latin America and a variety of other places. Roman numeral number 18. The future of the Philippines, that immense archipelago that lay 5,000 miles from California, the future of the Philippines seemed unclear. Initially, the United States hoped to basically only keep Manila, the capital and most developed city, because it had a fine harbor. But Manila wasn't defensible unless you also had Luzon, which was a large island on which the city was located. So you can't just have Manila, you have to have the whole island of Luzon. And it's after some deliberation, McKinley more or less found a justification for taking the whole chain of islands, the whole archipelago. He decided that we could not leave the Filipinos to themselves. They were unfit for self-rule. And so you see a new manifestation of the old white man's burden, that this country just can't handle it on their own. There might be some truth to that. If a country's been occupied by a foreign power and run as a dependent colony for a certain amount of time, it is hard to just turn around and give them self-rule without some practice in government, but it sure sounds awful pandering the way that McKinley put it. Subpoint B. The Filipinos were outraged at the Treaty of Paris and its call for annexation. In 1899, Emilio Aguinaldo, that Philippine rebel that we met earlier, he led a new fight for independence against the United States now. So he's no longer fighting for independence against Spain. Now he's turned his battle towards America. When Aguinaldo used guerrilla tactics to cause chaos for the Americans, the United States forced Filipinos to live in designated zones in poor conditions. It's not quite a concentration camp, but it kind of smells like one. During occupation, white American soldiers tended to see Filipinos as an inferior race. African American troops were troubled at this. There were African American troops serving in the army, and they're watching that, like, white soldiers going and treating Filipinos like, second-class citizens, I suppose. I'm not even sure that citizen is the right word for it. And a lot of black troops deserted the army to go join the Filipinos in a resistance movement. It took almost 3 years to put down that rebellion, and the cost of 20,000 Filipino lives to go fight for their independence. 4,000 Americans were also killed in the fighting, and a cost of $400 million. It was 20 times the price of buying the islands. So the Treaty of Paris negotiated that the United States would go buy the islands, and the cost of keeping it safe was far, far more expensive than the purchase price. The United States set up a government in the Philippines pretty similar to what you find in Puerto Rico. The American president appointed a governor there, and the governor then appointed the upper house of the legislature, sort of the equivalent of the Senate. The people in an election voted for the lower house, and so you had an elected lower house, an appointed upper house, and an appointed governor. The Philippines eventually became independent after World War II on July 4th of July, but 1946. Roman numeral number 19. So let's turn towards China, which heretofore has not been an important part of our story, but while we are talking about imperialism, I think this is where we'll also pick up this topic. Subpoint A. The United States' main interest in the Philippines was really as a gateway to China. China was seen as a vast potential market and an important investment opportunity. Now, China was the sick man of Asia. They were weakened by years of exploitative trade practices and war and foreign meddling. France and Great Britain and Japan and Russia, they all had settlements and spheres of influence scattered around the country of China. And so, China existed as an independent country, but not as a strong one, and really susceptible to bullying from outside influences. Subpoint B. Fearing that China would be carved into European colonies, and more importantly, that the United States would be shut out of the deal, U.S. Secretary of State John Hay, the guy that gave us our term earlier that the Spanish-American War was a splendid little war, John Hay issued what were known as the Open Door Notes. The Open Door Notes were letters of policy statements to the leaders of imperialist nations that countries should share their trading rights with the United States. They said, no country should have a monopoly on trade with really any part of China, and thus keep an open door. So that's where we get the term the Open Door Notes, or the Open Door Policy, that nobody should shut any country out of trade opportunities. The other powers agreed, but they agreed reluctantly. Subpoint C. Although China remained a free country, European powers dominated most of their major cities. Some Chinese people formed secret societies, resistance movements, and the most famous of them was known as the Boxers. Now, formally, their title is pretty awesome. They're known as the Society of the Righteous and Harmonious Fists, which is, honestly, that's pretty cool. But these societies wanted to expel foreigners and expel foreign influence from the country of China. Boxers killed hundreds of foreigners, as well as any Chinese Christians, because Christianity was seen as an example of outside influence. In August of the year 1900, the United States, Great Britain, France, and Germany, and Japan, they all teamed up to put down that Boxer Rebellion, which was a simmering civil war in China. They marched on the Chinese capital and forced the end of the rebellion, but not before thousands of Chinese people were killed during the fighting. Subpoint D. After the rebellion was put down, the United States feared that European imperialists would use that rebellion as an excuse to take further control of the country of China. John Hay responded by issuing these Open Door Notes, saying the United States would safeguard for the world the principle of equal and impartial trade with all parts of the Chinese empire. That would keep trade open. This open door policy reflected American beliefs about the American economy, that growth depended on exports, that the United States had the right to keep international markets open, and that closing an area to trade would threaten the very survival of America. These beliefs became the backbone of foreign policy, and I think are still pretty influential in the way that Americans approach the rest of the world. Approaching the rest of the world is quite a great story, and we're going to spend most of the rest of the year talking about it, and I can't wait to tell you more. Make sure you like and subscribe. God bless you.